On this episode of the Security Trek, I have with me Michael Weiss. He is the CISO, global CISO at Funding Circle. We're going to be talking about a few different topics. A couple of main areas are talking about getting into the industry, dealing with low unemployment rates. Obviously, it's very difficult to find security professionals. We're going to touch on the mental health aspect of people in security and avoiding burnout, and also the convergence of software and security further into the SDLC. I'm excited to talk to Michael. I appreciate you being on. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, Amir. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So I did not do justice to your background. Just to set the stage, my 20 seconds is not sufficient. If you could maybe provide some context in terms of who you are and how you got here, and then we'll dive into it.
So I've been in the security realm for now 16 years. I actually thought that I was not going to be well suited for it. I had done a little bit in financial services back in the late 90s at Microsoft. And some of what I worked on, it was a protocol for connecting financial institutions. And I really just had never thought that I was going to be able to talk security. So I sort of, viewed those people with, the I'm not worthy sort of viewpoint. And it just so happened someone who I was working with at the time later on had a job in a security org he had moved into. And he said he thought I'd be good at it. I jumped in and was working on security at MSN. I loved it. I didn't realize how much I was going to love it. It was very exciting. And so that was really my start in it. And I did incident response, application security, a whole bunch of those sorts of things, and sort of moved my way around. And I had a chance to do almost everything in security at one point or another. And so that's kind of how I was able to get where I am today at Funding Circle.
Awesome. I guess just, this is going to go way back, but I thought, we're going to talk about people getting into the industry and kind of using that segue of your own experience of you didn't think you'd be good at it. What was it about security that provided that, thought in your mind?
Well, you always hear about, it's really hard. There's just so much to know and it's very specialized. I think it sort of has generated that kind of, it's a special kind of person and only a very, very few people can do this. I think there are some certain natural talents that people have. If you like to break things, take things apart, you're typically going to be better suited for security. And that was actually something I enjoyed a great deal. But there's kind of this mystical thing about it that the reality isn't quite in line with. I played around as a, teenage hacker of sorts. I wasn't very good at it, but as a preteen, I saw the movie War Games, and I thought, oh my God, that's the coolest thing ever. And so, a little war dialing, a little blah, 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 but I didn't do anything really serious. I was too afraid to be put behind bars. And it was only for bragging rights. Come on, my freedom isn't worth that, right? So I kind of walked away from it, and I didn't touch it again until in grad school. I had a security class at CMU, and the guy was fantastic. I guess you'd expect from CMU. But one of the things I learned from it is while I had been away from security, it had turned into this, multi-billion-dollar business on both sides of the ledger. So, that had me rethinking what it was all about. So when I had the opportunity, I was, let's see what this is about. I do love it. I really do.
That's interesting because I think the notion that it's very difficult, I think that's a natural stigma. Anyone who associates security with anything, heck, I'm sure if somebody asks you for your personal life, hey, how do I deal with the security thing, in-law, friend, and they view just home security as super complicated. You make it now, enterprise, global security, multiple threats externally. It's just the notion of security, I think in any relevant terms seems very complicated to just the person who's not within it in any terms at all.
There's truth to that, but I know that never in my life did I have any chance of finding myself on the field of an NFL game actually playing, right? I knew I didn't have the raw materials. It didn't matter how hard I worked at it. This is a little different. There's a lot to learn, obviously. And, as the arms race happens, it gets much more complicated. When I got into it 16 years ago, you'd go to Black Hat and you could actually fit the entire security community as it was in one very large ballroom in Las Vegas. Now, there's no hope. You can't fit it in, 3 or 4 hotels in Vegas. So, it has grown tremendously. And with that, the specialization, that's happened on both sides of the ledger. So there's always a lot to learn, but the fundamentals haven't changed.
Absolutely. Just talking about that evolution in terms of specialization, obviously security professionals in demand 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There's just the demand has not gotten better. It's not eased. Has the specialization helped in terms of finding people that are particularly good at one aspect, or is it actually adding a little bit of more pain in terms of trying to find somebody who actually has a subset of knowledge? Well, with experience, obviously, that might be the other caveat to all this.
Well, it's really a little of both. Like most of the time, what I'm looking for are people who are a bit more generalists because unless you've got a very large organization, you're not going to have much use in the specialization. I mean, if you're Google security, specialization is great. You need it. You've got a massive organization. But most companies are going to have, 30 or fewer employees in their security organization. That doesn't leave you a whole lot of room for deep specialization. I mean, sure, you've got some specializations in incident response or in application security or infrastructure security or risk management, that sort of thing. But to get to the level of, I'm one of the world's experts on DNS, that kind of pigeonholes you if you're going to work for a small organization. LinkedIn probably needs a few DNS specialists, but certainly Funding Circle doesn't. We're just not that size company. And so that's what I look for is people who are more generalists and more importantly, people who have the curiosity to go into greater depth in whatever field as the need arises. That's much more interesting.
Absolutely. When you mention, looking for the generalist with that curiosity, I know in talking to you previously, building the organization, given just the difficulty in finding, security professionals of any kind, and you guys are growing startup, you're fairly sizable for a startup, but still growing. Where do you look, obviously, for that generalist, or how do you look for the generalist with curiosity? Where do you start finding those people?
Well, I mean, you can obviously go to the same places that everybody does. And one of the dangers of going to the same place that everybody does, it's the 8-year-olds playing soccer. Everybody is chasing that same ball and most of the field is completely empty. Where you really succeed more in areas that are high demand like that is you go against the grain. Don't look where everybody else is. So it's sort of giving away a secret here, I guess, but I'm probably not the first to discover this. Looking for security adjacent type roles, people who are, in DevOps organization or IT or developers who have a natural interest in security. One thing that I love is I so frequently get asked by people in those areas, hey, what do I need to do to get into security? And I said, well, you just made the first step. you know, you expressed the interest. Let's talk. Let's see. What is it that what are you interested in? Some say, well, it's the money. And I go, if it's just the money, you're probably going to be sorely disappointed. I mean, it pays reasonably well, don't get me wrong, but you really have to love this or you will burn out in a hurry. But what's great is when you talk to the ones who they already have the mindset. They're thinking about, how security systems don't work. And, if they're doing, particularly when you talk about like someone in IT or DevOps, spend their lives doing security settings all the time. You've got someone who's in IT or in DevOps, and they're dealing in settings all the time. And they see how these things are supposed to work a certain way, but wait a minute, it's pretty easy to get around it if you do whatever. Those people are great. That's exactly the foundation for having that sort of curiosity and recognizing that things don't always work in the happy path, right? So for those people, if they don't have yet the fundamental knowledge, I'll send them to places like a WASP, for example. I'll ask them to listen to some Black Hat or DEF CON talks, see what sorts of things are interesting to them, but also maybe help guide them into some areas where it seems that they have a good affinity. Once they have some of those fundamentals, I'm more than happy to hire them as a junior person on the team. And they get a mentor and they get more involved, learn more by doing. I've hired a number of people that way, many of whom have gone elsewhere to have illustrious careers elsewhere. But it's been great. For me, I view that as a success. I don't need to have them work for me for forever. What I want is to fill the security world with more people like that, get more people in. We just don't have anywhere near enough supply for the kind of demand that we have.
I guess a question to you would be is the way you view training of security professionals, obviously trying to find some of the outliers, people interested, making the move, pivoting into it for the right reasons. Do you feel industry wide that's shared, or do you think that's still a little bit more narrow in terms of how people are viewing the skill itself in terms of, hey, I need the exact person and I will just not hire until I find him or her versus, someone's close enough. I can mold that person. I can give them the skills they need to get there.
I think the molding is really the key question. There are certain non negotiables. I need that person to be ethical, for example. I need not to have to worry that they're going to take advantage of the extra power that necessarily comes with the role. Also, I need them to be curious. If you know 100% of exactly what I need for the role today, but you don't evolve, you're going to be useless to me in a year. And now what do I do? I don't like laying people off. I don't like firing them. So it's bad for them. It's bad for me. If you have somebody who's adaptable, who has a hunger to learn and an interest and an ability to do that, the great thing is that you can keep them around for a long time because there's always plenty of new stuff. And, like I said, the fundamentals don't really change, but what you're working on in any given moment will change. You run into a security incident that uncovers a whole area of your infrastructure you didn't even know was there until this happened. And all of a sudden, okay, well, now we've got to go and sink our teeth into how does this whole system work and how does it fit into the rest of our infrastructure and what are the vulnerabilities and what are the risks and what are the resources we need to get this done. It's like finding a new greenfield to work on. It's great. I mean, it's scary, because you'd rather know about it before the incident happens. But when and if it does, it's a great opportunity too.
I think in security, that's more true than anywhere else. It's the nature of the beast almost. You're on your toes as proactive as you can be, but when you need to react, adapting seems to be a very strong suit to the industry.
Yeah, it is the single most important asset that I look for anybody I hire.
Interesting. So I guess question for you. I mean, who you're looking for, curiosity. I mean, you seem like a very curious person that you like learning. One of the biggest challenges as you get a little bit more removed from the technology, the day-to-day execution of it is staying up on what you need to. Where do you find the balance to kind of staying up on the latest, what you need to know in the security space? And obviously, you have a team that needs to learn a lot of the nitty-gritty, but what do you do yourself to kind of keep up?
The security conferences are still useful in different way for me than it used to be. Again, when I first started going, it was a much smaller and less specialized for one thing. But also, as I said, the fundamentals don't change. So you end up going and you hear the same concepts that you learned 10 years ago, just applied in a slightly different way. It's probably not the best use of your time. But what's great about these conferences is they tend to also have the talks available online. So you can go through them much more quickly. A lot of the players will let you go at double speed if you need to. You can listen to the first 10 minutes and hear what they're going to be talking about. And it's like, oh, great, I already know where this is going. That's fine. I can move on to something else. So you can make more efficient use of your time in those sorts of situations, which was very hard to do, of course, at the security conference, especially when there's limited room in the conference rooms. Once you've got yourself in the seat and you're sort of committed, and then, 10 minutes in, you're like, oh, well, that wasn't really the best use of my time. But by that point, it's too late. So the online thing really does help a lot. And, there are Slack groups where people share their own experiences. You can find some things on LinkedIn. It's really interesting how the social space has evolved in the past 10 years or so. So I end up hearing a lot from other people who've been going through similar sorts of experiences, or they run into something that's like, this is big enough that we ought to be paying attention to. And so you read about that and start having conversations about it. And that makes a difference.
I guess, yeah. I mean, the social communities have gotten more specific, they've gotten more niche and narrow. When it comes to being, let's say, in a Slack group with other professionals, what's the ability to talk about a specific issue without getting too specific to your org? What's the challenges of kind of dancing around that?
It depends on the groups. For some, there are very strict rules of not discussing anything outside of the group that anyone else talked about, specifically to help encourage more frank conversation. Because if you feel like you can't really express yourself, you don't get a good exchange of information. So I really like that. You have to find one of those, and they tend to be invitation only, and they tend to place themselves very well. Even outside of that, though, you can often speak in generalities. There are things that everybody is having to deal with. How do you handle onboarding and offboarding of people's accounts? How do you put together single sign-on in a world where you're using a bunch of cloud services that may support nothing more than username password? What do you do when, in fact, they not only are username password, but your entire company gets one account and you have to share it? Those kinds of problems are the same for everybody. So, how we learn from those, how we go through our own experiences stumbling around with them, it's still fairly new to have companies where almost everything is SaaS, where you've got really nothing in house other than a small amount of glue to stick all of the SaaS together. So, there isn't yet a lot of maturity in that space. We're having to build a lot of things with baling wire and duct tape. Those kinds of conversations are hugely valuable. We learn more quickly, we evolve more quickly. And even if I'm talking to someone who's working at a competing company, we don't compete on security. And in fact, if another company who is a competitor of ours, but in the same space, fails miserably in terms of security and there's really bad press around it, that hurts my business. That hurts me and my ability to keep my job because if you can't trust fintech in general, then the whole thing collapses and we all lose. So it's really important.
That's interesting. I guess I had another guest on that mentioned everyone's security is on the same team. And again, you just mentioned a competitor who has a security vulnerability, a breach that reflects poorly on everybody. I guess when it comes to the actual company, everyone's competing on features. It seems like security might have a little different nature in terms of it's a big enough community, everyone's solving the same problems, and it is a us against them. I guess you can define who them is, but you're talking about everyone who's not with you, who's trying to get through your security. And that seems like a very unique environment. Yeah, marketing people would not share marketing tips. They don't want to help the competitor pick up something that's going to help a little bit more with their funnel or salespeople or engineering. So it's kind of unique, I think.
Think about the airline industry. You don't hear United saying we have fewer crashes than American. That's just not the way you do business. Security and safety are the sorts of things that, in general, you don't want to have as big public competitive advantages. Now, I say that, and then I think, well, Volvo certainly has made a lot of marketing around we're a safer car. If you're going to have the kid in the car seat, you better have them in a Volvo, that sort of thing. But yeah, I don't think that that's beneficial when it comes to something like an airline or when it comes to computer security. To some degree, I kind of wish it mattered more with Internet of Things because there's just no security whatsoever to speak of in that space, and it scares the hell out of me.
You're right. I mean, I was actually thinking through while you were mentioning it, who's used security as a competitive advantage. Volvo obviously stands out as one. I even was thinking Brinks, the actual armored people. I don't really know if they talk about that. Again, to your point, them failing one time has such a bad ramification that you don't necessarily want to make that the hill you die on because that becomes a very slippery slope.
Yeah, that's a huge danger. If you say I'm safer than everybody else, as soon as you have a breach, it's game over. As you put it, that is the hill you die on. That would be a scary thing for me. And, I mean, just speaking like from a personal point of view, if I made that the hill I die on, my career dies on it. That's a pretty scary place to be, too.
And that's just a difficult standard to live. I mean, security, ADT, if we're going to talk about things that are even just local to every day, the ADT security system, they say we'll respond quickly. They don't say we're going to have you avoid any break-ins totally or, deter. We're going to respond if we hear that. And that's all they assure you of, that they are there if you need them. What does that mean? We don't know. So it's interesting. It just applies to, we're talking Volvo, we're talking home security, not even enterprise security. But I think security in general is one of those where it's difficult to say 100% yes, probably through time. How have you kept somebody out? That's eternal battle.
Well, the other thing is ADT sells security. That is actually the product that they sell.
Yes.
I think you look at a company like Palo Alto Networks, that is what they sell. If they fail at security, they've failed at their core product. This is McDonald's selling you a bad hamburger. They fail at it. That is their core product. That's what they're selling. But that's not what I sell or what Funding Circle sells. We issue loans to small businesses. We find investors for those loans. Security is part of what we do in the same way that maintaining a website is part of what we do, but it's not core to our business. It's definitely not what we want to project as the main part of what we do as a business.
That's a clear difference in terms of security as a product versus security as a component of the business, like you mentioned, the website at Funding Circle. So I guess just to kind of, get back a little bit maybe down the path we were, because I wanted to touch on, obviously we were talking about how you address talent, you look, diamonds in the rough. On the flip side of it, Obviously, with the lack of people to actually come do the job, there's a lot of pressure on the existing staff to always deliver. Maybe particular to you or just your views in general, but like the mental health aspect of cybersecurity professionals, is that something that you think about with your team? And maybe what sort of ways?
There's a lot of different ways matters. One is, just a time in your, on state. If you're in incident response in particular, you may be called up at 3 in the morning just as easily as you would at 3 in the afternoon. Incident response is a particularly difficult place to be for that reason. That was, as I said, the first job that I had in security was in MSM, and incident response was one of the things I did. It was very exciting for my wife and me the first Saturday that I had to do an incident, and I had to drop everything and go into a coffee shop, and I'm working on this thing. That particular incident was actually the gift that kept on giving. The third weekend in a row that it happened, my wife wasn't so keen on this whole thing. It sounds really exciting when it's, you're getting to go and do some 007 type stuff, but it gets old in a hurry. And imagine that being your life day after day after day, week after week. Your time isn't your own. I'd imagine that's what first responders in New York were feeling like during the COVID spike in April. It wears you down. So there's a few things I think about there. One is incident response is usually a place that people may enter security, but I don't find them typically wanting to stay there for a particularly long time. You help them get out before it reaches that point where they just abandon security altogether. And, they'll be interested in, like, after having gone through a few incidents, it's like, wow, if only we did these things, we would prevent it from happening in the first place. And that's great. That's exactly the mindset you want for them moving into maybe an audit role, maybe an application security role, maybe an infrastructure security role, because now they felt the pain viscerally. What could motivate you more than saying, wow, I'd really like to keep someone else from feeling that pain again? It makes a huge difference. And I've had that happen in my career a few times where I do a particular job and go, wow, if only. And then I move into the job where I get to do the if onlys. And it's a really good feeling. You feel exceptionally motivated and a great sense of accomplishment when you've made life better for the people who come behind you. So that helps. And keeping things fresh always helps. Right? Any job that you do where it's the same thing over and over again for years on end can become a slog. I've often wondered about people like, bus drivers, how they feel about that. I've talked to airline pilots who say, yeah, but I have the best office in the world. I really can't complain. So, I can understand it for them, but I wouldn't feel that way, I don't think, as a bus driver, for example. That to me, I'd get bored.
It seems like, it's one of those roles where if you want to postpone, a feature release or something on the engineering side, I mean, you could. I mean, it's not going to, unless it's a patch or a bug issue that's bringing the product down. But you have that time that you could potentially delay. And in the sense of security and incident response, I don't believe you have that luxury, and that pressure is probably always there. That, even if I'm asleep in the middle of the night, much like you mentioned, first responder in New York, I mean, pager, phone, whatever goes off, you've got to be at the ready. It's interesting that the burnout before they leave the industry you mentioned is the key. And I hadn't really thought about that.
Yeah, and there's a second thing that burns people out, and I try really, really hard to avoid it happening in my org. The security team needs to have credibility in the company that they work at. So they need to really spend a lot of time avoiding being viewed as crying wolf. Because what happens then is, the security team sort of gets the pat on the head. That's nice, but we've got real work to do. And so you feel this need to get the word out, but nobody's listening to you. That is exceptionally demeaning. When you know that there's something wrong, nobody wants to do anything about it. And in the end, something bad happens and you say, I told you so, but you couldn't prevent the car accident. What a demoralizing way to live. And you end up getting not just burned out, but you get bitter, resentful. One of the things that has been kind of sad to me is when I'd go to Black Hat or DEF CON and I would meet people who have gone through that. And there's a lot of them. And, you just feel so bad for them because they're not able to make a difference. All they're able to do is see the disasters that are going to be coming and watch them happen. That'll burn you out, no question. So it's critical as a result that you be very careful about what you tell the executives or the people who are developing the software or the people who are managing the systems. What you tell them is at risk, what they need to do next, and how much should they care? How urgently should they care? So you say, there's this thing. when you get a chance, you should do it. Or, there's this thing, it's got to get done in the next day or two because this is hugely bad. Tune it, tune that message so that they understand not everything is, an imminent nuclear attack. And then they trust you because when you say, no, this one really is, they realize you don't ever say that unless it really is true. You get the results you need when you need them.
So, I mean, that's an interesting use case. So, someone in your team that maybe goes through that, maybe they make the wrong call, there's a little bit of fallout, they're feeling demoralized, they're feeling down. How do you, I guess, respond to them? What is it that you can do to help them?
People will make the wrong calls all the time because they're humans and we deal with imperfect information. We fill the gaps in information with our own prejudices, whether we like it or not. And so we'll make wrong decisions. What's important to me is a couple of things. One, someone who works for me, I want to make sure that they have the power to do everything that they can do safely based on their knowledge and their experience. So if they can make mistakes, they can fail and, step on a rake and get smacked in the face, but it doesn't end their career and it doesn't end the organization's credibility. They get a chance to learn. And stepping on rakes is a great way to learn not to step on rakes. So it's really, at that point, just making it appropriate to their level of experience and giving them air cover so that, if they do something that might look stupid in retrospect, but was totally reasonable under the circumstances at the time, that's where I'll take the heat. And that helps a lot. It helps because if people feel that they can make mistakes without it ending their career or having hugely negative blowback, they're more willing to take risks. And taking risks and making mistakes, that's where you learn. That's where you get better. That's where you grow and expand and become more of a person than you were before.
That's a great view of, obviously, that's probably a very critical nature. Emotionally, someone's charged by having gone through something like that. And from there, they do need to kind of get back to the same point of being able to pick it up and realize that that's not going to happen again. And there's a learning pivot from that. And what they take from it, I guess, will show them what kind of person you have on your team as well. I think part of it's on them as much as it is from your standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, when things go wrong, the big thing that I ask is, what did you learn from this? How are you going to avoid having this happen again in the future? Where I get upset is if somebody makes the same mistakes over and over again, because you're not growing, you're not evolving. This goes back to what I was talking about. Your ability to adapt is so important. This is really where you demonstrate whether you can do it or not.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I think the mental health side, I guess there's such a strain. I guess there's such a stigma that we talked about. It's difficult, an arduous role that you're in, and lots of pressure. Avoid crying wolf, and knowing how big that alarm should be, how quiet, and kind of tuning that message to the appropriate level. It's such a balance to me. You're the practitioner, I'm not, but the balance between an art and a science, because obviously, at the time you're taking information points and trying to make the best decision a lot of times real time.
It absolutely is. What's great, though, is when you know that somebody tried to attack you and something that you did before stopped them, where you had the right conversation with the right person at the right time, where you made that little change in the design. And, there's this moment of joy. It's like, I got you. I got you. First time I had that happen actually was in that MSN role. There was someone who was hacking MSN Messenger. And there was a new feature that Messenger was coming out with. And this attacker was making a whole lot of noise about he was going to drop an O-Day on us after we released this new feature. But he wasn't going to say anything else. He was just, he'll drop this one on us. It just so happened I kind of had an idea of what it was that he was planning on doing. And I had already designed a mitigation for that particular vulnerability. And sure enough, we released. And the day after, he posted, says, well, they figured it out. And nope, I'm not going to be attacking that. Yeah, that was a really, really great day for me. Those moments really matter. I mean, you think about, when I was doing security for Windows 7, we were talking about whatever we released was going to be on 1 billion computers. That's a lot of impact that you have. Knowing that you make a positive difference on that kind of scale is hugely rewarding. So it's sort of the other side of that ledger about the, demoralizing when you can't do something. When you do it and you know that you've made things better, what better reward could you have in this field?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great story. And I think that's probably why a lot of people stay in it. It's that thrill of knowing the next win is such a high.
It is.
It's a bit of that adrenaline chasing. You mentioned, yeah, I think earlier you said, you were going to be an NFL field, but there's a billion computers at home and you stop a vulnerability that potentially could affect that many people. That's a rock star moment. That's pretty amazing.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's just recognizing, where you can have your rock star moments.
There you go.
Mine's definitely not going to be on the football field.
That's awesome, Michael. I appreciate it. More and more managers and directors I speak to, I mean, you see it on a daily basis. Everyone wants to have someone that understands security in the software space. It's not something that when they say we want this software engineer with security background, we're like, we can't find it. It's not common. And a lot of it goes to what you mentioned earlier in terms of finding the diamond in the rough. Like this convergence, I mean, it's a trend. It's just going to keep growing, correct?
It absolutely is. And there's a lot of back and forth discussion about whether it makes sense to have security champions programs where you have someone embedded in the team who is particularly strong in security. I'm still mostly on the pro camp for security champs, but one of the dangers you run into is everybody's always stretched thin in terms of their resources. So if you've got 10 people on the team, you need 20. If you've got 20, you need 50, right? And so if you have somebody who is the security specialist, that's great until you need that dev to be working on this other thing. And then all of a sudden, security takes a back seat again. The real benefit comes when you have more than just a person on each team who's thinking security. I mean, that can be the tip of your spear to get one person in there. But if you get one in and you think, well, I'm done, you're doing it wrong. You don't go and hire developers and say, well, only one of you actually needs to think about whether your code is going to run, right? It's a core of what you do. Security needs to sort of become a core of what they do. They need to think about not only how do things work in the way you intended, but how do things work in the way you didn't intend? Because that's where the bugs are, whether they're security bugs or they're reliability bugs, memory resource bugs, whatever they are, they come from the fact that the person who's writing the code doesn't think about some of the permutations. That's really the core of security. So you get these programs in place. You want it to be as many people on these teams as possible so that security becomes something that they think about all the time. And if they have questions, if they go, well, wait a minute, this looks a little wonky to me, I'm not sure what to do, you need to have a centralized security team for them to come to be a tier 2 security support. But tier 1, it still works best when it's on the team. I mean, you hear a lot these days now of not having separate testing organizations, that you have the engineers who write the code, you have other engineers in that same team do the testing of the code, and they all sort of pair up. It should behave in a similar sort of fashion with security.
Yeah, it's kind of seems like, before security was, we're going to build the code, we're going to ship the product, and then security, you make sure that no one breaks it, gets into it. And now it's like, well, that's like saying, hey, we built the bridge and it's slightly crooked. Can you guys come in and even out this bridge? Why aren't we involved in actually helping construct the bridge? It sounds like that's a lot more of what should be happening just to fortify things more.
Sure, it's the rule you've probably heard, orders of magnitude of cost.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the whiteboard, it costs one thing. When you commit it to code, it costs 10 times as much. When you've released it, it costs another 10 times as much to address. So the closer you get to the whiteboard, shifting left, that's what they keep talking about here. That's the reason why you do this. It's so much less expensive and things move more quickly. And the people who create the problems, it sounds bad that way, but I mean, developers create bugs. And that's okay. That's because they're human and we're all that way. But the closer you get to the person who creates the bug being aware of it and fixing it, the greater the likelihood is that they'll learn from it and not make the same mistake in the future. They get to be better developers.
I was going to ask you, and obviously you don't have to answer out of curiosity because obviously things are shifting to the left. Microsoft built a reputation of, release it and deal with it later. Not always the best feeling for some of the users, I should say. We could choose some words there, but has that been a big evolution in terms of, as you mentioned, shifting it to the left just to improve the actual customer experience, customer retention, not even just from the standpoint of worrying about the threat, but having somebody deal with the virus or the bug or the issue and having to have some kind of ill feeling towards the product or platform?
It's interesting you mentioned this Microsoft reputation because, of course, I was on the other side. I was inside watching the sausage being made, as it were. It is so hard when you're dealing with software that very quickly grew to be as complex as the software that Microsoft was developing was. You could try and make it perfect and never release it. You could get it to some point and where it's good enough. It was always very hard to decide how good is good enough. And what techniques do you use for testing? In many, many ways, Microsoft had to be on the leading edge of a lot of those things. And for better or worse, we all, as users of the software, had to pay some of the price for the fact that it was all so leading edge.
It's actually really interesting what you mentioned because I think, at the time, as many desktops as copy of Windows of some version was on, maintaining multiple versions. I mean, I don't know what the percentages are, probably, at some point at 20, 30, 40% of the world's desktops, whatever they were. I mean, you probably know better than I do, but there's no single way of stopping all that. Like, I mean, that would have been an impossible task, versus, like you mentioned, getting it out. And I was actually just talking about how if security is going to shift left, potentially the end user, the experience will be different for them because they might not be seeing some of what typically could be getting through to them, as you mentioned, versus it's getting kind of squashed before it even could see the light of day.
There's definitely improvements that can be made in that space, and I think that will help. I mentioned earlier about Internet of Things. There's the joke that has gone around for a while now that the S in IoT stands for security. There's no incentive for a lot of businesses to put the amount of time and effort necessary to make things secure. When you go and get your little internet connected webcam at the store, there's nothing in there that indicates whether this thing is better or worse from a security standpoint. The thing that you look at is features on the box and the price, and security doesn't enter into the equation there. What has to change there is people have to demand it. People have to insist upon it because otherwise the market forces work, in fact, against security. One thing I still worry about is that we've sort of gotten used to security breach stories in the press. Oh, it's another case where a bunch of data got lost. And the consequences of those breaches, I think, have been diminishing rather than increasing. That worries me because I have to use some of those services. There's certain things I can't avoid using, and that scares me. I want these things to be more secure. And unless we demand it, it's not going to be there. A shift left or not, they're just not going to invest in it at all.
What's interesting is just to touch on the IoT topic is so you have quality providers building components and they're doing the due diligence for security as much as they can, higher price point. And then you have on various selling platforms knockoffs that come on that are knockoffs and they do not have a forethought of security built in and they're put out and people get them and it's like, well, someone got into my webcam or various other issues and it's like, well, that's when somebody goes, I should have sprung $40 more for the brand webcam because they at least have some thought going into these problems.
Sure, but that's assuming that they know that they got compromised in the first place.
Good point.
Right. These webcams are my refrigerator. My refrigerator can connect to the internet. Mine doesn't. I mean, it's capable, but I'm sure not going to hook it up to my network. Absolutely not. Washers and dryers. What? Right? These are typically fairly low-powered Linux computers who run a particular version of Linux that never gets patched. So maybe at the time that it was released, it was up to snuff, but there's what I call security erosion that occurs. The longer you have this thing, more vulnerabilities get detected, more attacks get designed for it. So what do these all get used for? Well, they might be used for, botnets, or maybe they're used to mine for Bitcoin. Whatever it is that they're being used for, you may have no idea that it's going on, but it's using resources that are in your environment. Or it could be the tip of the spear that gets into your home network. And no matter what you do to keep rebuilding your PC or, getting new mobile phones, this becomes the reservoir from which all of the malware gets onto your other devices. I mean, it's really scary. These mobile phones, they are, first off, they're far more powerful than, giant room-filled things were 50 years ago. But we have our entire lives in them. all of our contacts, our connections to banks, where we've been, who we've seen, who we talked to, all of the communications that we have. It's all in one place. I mean, it tells an attacker everything that they need to know to then initiate a social engineering attack on you and just trick you into giving them all your money.
It's interesting. My daughter's now 7, and we try to give her some freedom with her iPad, and we want her to explore. And there's always another game her friends playing, and she wants to download the same. And we say, okay, yes. And then she gets the part of the game where she can't continue unless she logs in with Apple or Facebook. And that's when we're like, no. And she just doesn't get it. But I'm just waiting for the day where she's going to get it enough to go create an account and do whatever she asks because she really wants to play. It might be 2 years from now, next year. I have no idea. But, to your point of these devices, and she wouldn't know because, she's 7, but that would potentially be a massive issue for someone. And unknowingly, I mean, yeah, heck, the email server at the DNC gets social engineering attacks. So let alone a preteen, we're talking about grown adults in the government.
It is exceptionally scary because these are all ways of manipulating natural human behaviors. There's a reason that casinos are so lucrative. If you lost every time that you played, you would be in there for no more than 5 minutes and you're never back. If you won every time that you played, they'd be out of business because you'd have all their money. It's finding that spot in the middle, that sweet spot where you respond to the occasional reward. And humans respond much better to the occasional reward than they do to the consistent one. And it's not just humans. I mean, in the studies with, cocaine for rats, the rats that push the lever the most are the ones who, at random times, get the dose, not the ones that get it every time. That's how it works with gambling. We're wired to behave certain ways that worked really well on the savannas of Africa. And now we don't live that life, but we still have all that wiring in there. And social engineers understand that wiring and understand how to exploit it. The simple things like I'm going to go into an office building and I want to get past the security guards. So what do? I carry a bunch of boxes with me. And someone will happily just open the gate to let me through because I can't show an ID or anything. Fine, you must belong here. You just get onto the other side. Those sorts of things are preying upon the natural social human tendencies. That's how these things work.
It's amazing you mentioned that. I was 18 or 19. I think it was my first year in college. And I get a call and they're like, hey, do you go to the school? I go, yes. And I'm thinking it's from the school. I mean, I wouldn't know. And they start asking me questions. And finally they say, can I have your social? And I'm like, hold on. If you're from my school, you don't need my social. You should know. I don't know. Teenager, what we do. So I stopped and I was like, okay, that's weird. I wonder if this is happening to other students. So I was driving into campus and I, local police, depot there. I stop in, I go in, I explain the situation. The guy goes, I'm glad you didn't because that's something we've heard about. We're trying to find a way to stop it. And then he said, let me ask you something. And he just held out a pen and I just went to grab it. And he goes, why'd you take my pen? Well, you put it out. And he goes, no one told you to grab it. It's just your instinct to want to grab it because I just held it out. And that just stuck to me. And it just kind of made me realize that I am susceptible to all those little small things, those human interactions that built into my DNA that I have to fight the tendency. But I realized at that point, at 18 or 19, that, okay, wow, I got to be careful of, security issues like that are so simple.
I had one today.
Wow.
Someone reached out to me on LinkedIn as another Funding Circle employee. I'm like, I don't recognize this name. And I went and I looked in the company directory, and sure enough, he wasn't there. But he had already managed to get a couple of other Funding Circle employees to link with him on LinkedIn. So at that point, I'm really very curious about this. And I dug in a little further and found it was a fake account. So I reached out to the others at Funding Circle who connected to him and let them know, yeah, you need to get away, disconnect from this guy. But I also then went and found there were a half dozen related accounts, and I reported them all to LinkedIn. And see this every now and then. People will do this because they get inside that sort of trust zone. And once they're inside that trust zone, there are all sorts of things. You manage to get the IT person, you go, oh yeah, I'm not able to log in any other way. Can you reset whatever account? And, expecting that they'll be able to log in during that window of time of a password reset. And that's how they get in. That's one method. Of course, we're all used to lots of different kinds of phishing emails that are also methods to get in. People who pretend to be CEO of the company or some senior executive. Happens all the time, all the time.
Wow. Michael, thank you. Great conversation. I appreciate. I think I could keep going, but recognize you have a day job, and I appreciate your time. Gracious for the time you spent with us. If someone does want to reach out to you, is LinkedIn the best area to hit you up, or where would you prefer?
Yeah, LinkedIn is totally fine.
Okay.
Michael Weiss on LinkedIn.
We'll add that to show notes when we release the podcast. Feel free to reach out to Mike with any follow-up questions. Thanks for being on again, and thanks for listening to this episode. If you could do a couple things for us, we're always looking for a little bit more traction on the podcast. One is topics, thoughts you want us to kind of cover in the podcast. We'd love to hear that. If you have any feedback on the podcast, or you want to subscribe or give us a rating, those are great ways to expose the podcast to more people, and we appreciate that. We'll be back next week with another guest. Until then, thank you.